Hello and Happy New Year, everyone. And welcome to 43rd session and the first session of this year of Post Media Tea Time Talk series. And my name is Sang, and I am joined here with Sarah, Marcel, and Madi, who are organizing members of PMTTT and Interpol Young Academy. And today, I am joined with two speakers who will be talking about mineral dissolution today. And the first speaker is Dr. Michał Dzikowski, who is a postdoc in University of Warsaw. So Michał obtained his PhD in computer fluid dynamics at the University of Warsaw. Oh, I'm sorry, the Warsaw University of Technology, working on lattice Boltzmann simulations of two-phase flow in thin gaps. After the PhD, Michał worked at the Computational Geology Lab at the Polish Geological Institute, where he got hooked up with geofluids and porous media. Now Michał is a postdoc at Piotr Szymczak's group at University of Warsaw, where he studies reactive transport instabilities and wormhole formation, doing both simulations and experiments. The title of his talk today is Large-Scale Numerical Study of Wormhole Formation in Limestone Core Samples. Michał, the floor is yours. And
so thank you guys for the invitation. I'm going to talk about the numerical simulations that we did during the initial phase of the LUMI project. So that's one of the largest computer in Europe that's being set up currently. I think it's already available to users. And I got invited for a so-called pilot project. So before everything was turned on completely, the internal guys wanted to test how it will work on scientific projects, but fingers crossed everything gonna work, but they were not promising anything. So we took the opportunity of the unlimited, essentially, resources to do some simulations that we were interested in. So essentially, then large-scale simulation of the formation of the wormholes. So sorry, next one, please. Okay, so wormhole, how we see it is that when there is a reactive flow through the porous media, and the reactant is able to dissolve the porous matrix, you can get the positive feedback between the flow and the reaction. So under right conditions, the flow, where the flow transport more reactant, then the more mass get dissolved, and then it creates more preferable flow path. And in the right setup, I would say you could create those wormholes, so strong preferential flow paths that are created by the reactive flow. So, for example, karsts, caves, and those large systems, but also very small ones. So those are processes that we investigate. Some of us in our lab do experimental work. I'm now assigned to it. So I will talk a little bit about that. So this is where the original data came from. Then I will talk a little bit about the physical model that's behind the numerical simulations and about numerical simulations on their own. So about beautiful pictures that came out of it. So how the wormhole look in the nature? There could be some very complicated channels that look like created by some animals. They could be strong conduit that are created in cars that look a little bit like being drilled. But they are also important for example, oil enhanced oil recovery or CCS, because they could hinder the process, or then could be used to create the preferential flow path at industrial scale when the acid is injected in some formation. And how we investigate it in the lab. So there are two ways but one of them is to to dissolve a limestone core using acid under the computer tomograph, so you would get the time-resolved images, something like the one on the right. So these beautiful tree-like structures that emerge from the lab experiments. So to create some very simple picture of it, in all cases that I'm going to talk about, there's a constant mass flow rate on the one side of the sample, and there is a fixed pressure on the other side of the sample. The flow is forbid to go outside of the sample. There's no periodic boundary or some escape zone here. And there's a wormhole, and there is a dissolution wormhole that appears inside this medium. And what's important for me is that this porous matrix is not really uniform. So there are some areas that are less permeable than the others. So there are some blockages here that strongly influence the way the wormhole is being created, because there are like obstacles on the way. We don't consider non-uniform properties chemically speaking. So the reaction rate is more or less constant everywhere. So those obstacles are only in terms of porosity, of amount of mass that is present in the given area. It's not that this area is more resistive to acid, for example. That could also be the case, but we are not doing that. So how it looks on experimental floor, you could either use a two-dimensional system. So that would be a fracture. You dissolve it with clean water and you observe it with a camera. It takes a few days to create a simple scenario, but the experimental is easy. It's a Hilly cell without dangerous components involved. So that's a very nice experiment. Or you could do high pressure core flooding with an acid, and that's done under CT. So that's both expensive and could be more complicated. So how it looks in the real life, so there's a lot of piping that's being involved, and the CT machine, that's Max Cooper actually. They use the setup to create time-resolved samples. So we have a both pressure signal and the geometry response to this in time. So there's, I think, around 100 CT scans through the around 12 hours of the experiment. And then in the result, you have some time evolution of the wormhole. This is not a simulation, this is an experiment. So the wormhole grows in a more or less, there are some areas that the wormhole grows more or less straight, but there are some areas that it could go even horizontally, which is not really that obvious that it was going to happen. But from some reason that was inside the rock, the dissolution moved from one area to another, because that was where the preferential evolution was, when the evolution was more preferable. So we try to recover that in numerics. And the other element that we wanted to recover in numerical simulation is this drops of the pressure drop. So one would expect that while wormhole at the tip of the wormhole advanced through the sample more or less linearly. In this case, there are this on this blue line that represents the pressure drop. It happens in stages. Yeah, so there are some areas that the pressure drop in time does not change a lot, but there are some areas that the pressure drop is really high on a short amount of time, and we suspect that's an effect of those highly non-permeable areas that needed to be passed for the pressure to fill it. So we wanted to try to recover that behavior in numerics based on the CT data that's of this sample. Yeah, so we took the CT scan of this sample and tried to recover that in numerics. We used a simple Darcy scale reactive flow model. So we assume that the flow and reactant transport is equilibrated in time on much faster than the evolution of porosity. So the evolution of porosity is an actual evolution in time. Okay, we use the Lumi supercomputer because we can do big models, then we can repeat the simulations, we can do sensitive studies. We didn't do that, but that's a possibility. And we have a lot more data, so the time of resolution of the simulation is potentially much higher than the resolution that you can get from the experiment in a most city machines. And the system is so the whole software is constructed around lattice Boltzmann solver, but it doesn't advance it in a times like in usual cases. We use lattice Boltzmann to obtain the flow field and concentration field, but global evolution is governed outside. So only this blue part is governed by the actual lattice Boltzmann solver, but it's not time dependent. Lattice Boltzmann is a bit different. So what we started to get is when we went for a subsample of the original set. First, what we found that the actual amount of data is rather important because number of degrees of freedom for such structure is important. And when you get bigger and bigger subsample, the structures that you get are more and more complicated because they have ability to respond to detail, to more and more properties or non-heterogeneities inside the matrix. So this is not downscaled. We just took more and more section at the same resolution of the original data, and you could see that the structures that appear are started to get more branched because they have space to do that. And the effect of the resolution could be also very drastic. Starting from left to right, the left is 30 microns. It's just a resolution of the city that we have. So there's no science behind it. Yeah, that's the data that we had, and we reduced the resolution by factor of 2. When we got to 120 microns, the same set of wormholes is only started to become just straight pipes. Even though the conditions are the same, it just there is not enough heterogeneity in the data set to capture all these tree-like structures. Okay, sorry. So the final and most important thing for us, it might not be best seenable here, but we wanted to capture this pressure drop. Okay, so so on the left, that's the reference, that's the data from the experiment, and there is maybe not a very significant thing, but there is this plateau of the pressure, and then there is sudden drop of it. And the same behavior we were able to recover it from the subsample of the in the numeric. So there is a certain area in the sample that there's with rather low permeability layers, and when the wormhole passes through them, you could actually observe that the pressure drops cease to develop because the wormhole seeks other positions to pass through this layer, and then there is a sudden drop of pressure and rapid growth of the wormhole, which then stops because it starts to branch outside of this low permeable area. We are still processing this data, so I hope that we will be able to illustrate it better. I started actually to stopped 2 weeks ago. So okay. So what we will be, what we for now were able to do is we were able to recover this leapfrog movement. So the wormhole stops at certain positions. It branched. It seeks another area to occupy, and this is also visible inside the pressure evolution. So there are those drops of pressure. Because of some properties, so some local non-heterogeneous of the medium, and it could strongly influence the industrial parameter, which is the time to breakthrough. And the other thing is that if we have enough heterogeneity and number of degrees of freedom, the resolution is big enough. So we have a really huge sample, like billion of cells. We could take a whole core our experiment, and we get the wormholing that's similar to those that we get from the experiment. So we are closer to being able to recover an actual experimental geometry. Okay. So thank you for your attention, I think, and that's it.
Okay. Thank you very much, Michał. So if people online, if they have any questions, please type them down and I will read to Michał. But currently, I have one question, like out of curiosity, have you ever considered the fractal factors, how these wormholes are developing through your porous media? Have you ever considered like studying from the fractal point of view?
I think that's being done. You know, we are now at the stage that I try to adopt the metrics that were used by experimental guys to numerics, because that's quite a lot of data in a very short time. And we try to put the numbers to like visual description. Yeah, so there's a tortuosity obviously and numbers like that. But so to compare those decent properties of the wormhole with those from experiments, had to go outside the simple things like a picture.
All right. Okay, great. Thank you.
I have a quick question, if I might. So it's you said it's the branching pattern is also dependent on the resolution, right? This is the resolution of the background map, so the permeability map, for instance, that goes into simulations, or is it like just that the simulation is not fine enough if the whatever cells you have inside the code are too large?
That's actually a good question. We the maximum resolution of data we have, that's the resolution of CT that we started from is 30 microns. So that's the maximum we could get here, and that was the resolution of the simulation. So one voxel of the simulation is 30 micron. So that's 100% for me. You obviously could you obviously could go higher, yes. So to I don't know, interpolate between the CT points and have some, so have, for example, 15 micron simulation. But I am thinking about to create some artificial porosity field. So the CT data would have the infinite resolution, and then we can study the influence of the numerics only in separate of the CT data.
Super, thanks.
Okay, great. So I don't see any questions typed down. If people from the studio don't have any question, maybe we can pass to Michał. All right. Our next speaker is Michał Chen. He received his PhD from MIT in 2019. He's studying the biochemical of metal contaminants in the porous media. He's currently at NSF Earth Science Postdoctoral Flow at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities, where he uses microfluidic tools and simulations to study coupled, porous scale, fluid flow, and chemical reactions relative to contaminant remediation in groundwater and carbon sequestration. The floor is yours, Michał.
Okay, let me just get this up. All right. So thank you for that introduction. I have to be sharing some of the work that we've been doing today, which we've titled Inertial and Convective Flows During Mineral Dissolution. And so in kind of the opposite of our previous speaker, I'll be talking mostly about experimental work looking very closely at kind of pore scale behavior. So something that we kind of in the community have observed recently is that we can get these really complicated kind of recirculating flows in fractured and porous media, which is a little bit unexpected, right? When you study porous media flow, you think, oh, we're going to get Stokes flow, we're going to get streamlines whose complexity just matches the tortuosity of our, our bead pack or our fracture. But what has recently been shown, and let me turn on my laser pointer, is that even for kind of these, for these kind of Stokes flow types cases, depending on how we arrange our porous media grains, we will get kind of recirculating flows that influence transport of solutes and the like. Similarly, we have also seen that mild inertial flows, right, moderate Reynolds numbers, so we're still in kind of a laminar regime, flows are steady, but still some contribution of inertial forces, leads to these more complicated, and I say complex, recirculating flows. And this happens both kind of in porous media and in fractured flow. And this image here is from a paper showing this occurring in a fractured flow. We should intuit then that if we've got these complicated flows altering transport, we should see an impact of these kind of recirculating flows on chemical reaction as well. And Song, who helped kind of set this up and introduce this, did a really cool and neat study showing how these inertial recirculating flows, which you can see appearing kind of here, alter chemical reaction dynamics and kind of enhance reaction. And I also have done a work previously showing how a very idealized porous media structure by like kind of 2 pore grains also influences kind of chemical reaction dynamics. However, most natural chemical reactions invoke mineral reactions, especially something like dissolution or precipitation, right? And we can think of a lot of different spaces where this is common, right? We can think about the evolution of natural landscapes where dissolution shapes things like the processes of karstification or weathering of other minerals. But we also are interested in these types of reactions, as well as the influence of inertial flows on them, even in engineered settings, for example, during carbon sequestration, where we want to rely on our acidic CO2 brine that is being injected to dissolve its host rock and then react with the resulting cations to form kind of precipitates, right? But here's the thing. When we move from kind of these 2 heterogeneous reactions involving minerals, we can also see the suggestion that there should be potentially some influence of gravity through kind of convective dissolution or the like. Indeed, there have been some really neat studies that show that, excuse me, that when you have natural rocks or other, rock-like materials dissolving, we will get density-driven flows. They're kind of hypothesized to form these natural kind of needle-like formations, and there's been a really neat study kind of investigating how that occurs. And then there's also been these really cool studies showing how, if you put a block of salt or caramel or a rock in just quiescent water, you can induce kind of a convective flow, which leads to flow patterns even in the absence of kind of something that's induced, right? And so our question was, how do these complicated inertial flows that we're observing in porous media interact in the presence of kind of mineral dissolution? Will these density-driven flows occur, or will they just not? Will they be suppressed by the strength of the kind of inertial flows? And indeed, that's kind of what I'll talk about today. We're going to mainly focus on some experimental work, and we're really focused on kind of a representative pore scale type system. As a little bit more background, my colleague Woong-hee Lee, who's also in Peter Kang's lab, has done some simulations looking at just inertial flows with calcite dissolution to give us a sense of at least how the inertial flows should influence dissolution trends. We, at low Reynolds number, I'll show you our little video here. Oh, no, I got to switch back to the mouse, maybe. So the videos aren't working. This is always how it goes, I feel like. What you would see is if I was playing this low Reynolds number video, you would see streamlines that follow very nicely the shape of our little sinusoidal pore throat. And then as time advances, our mineral is dissolving and receding backwards, further back. But what you would see is that near this inlet, you would see more dissolution than at the outlet. And that is essentially because our reactive fluid first contacts this inlet area and becomes less reactive as a result of kind of consuming some of that solid material. If we look instead at the Reynolds 100 case, what you would see are complicated recirculating flows that form in these kind of gaps here as our minerals dissolving away. And we would see a reversal of that trend. Essentially, the outlet would dissolve much faster than the inlet. And the logic for this is very similar to that of the low Reynolds case. At low Reynolds or at high Reynolds number, now our reactive fluid is actually being brought near to the exit and then contacting the solid while in as a part of this recirculation, right? It comes in, recirculates backwards. And that is essentially leads to this dissolution happening faster at the outlet than the inlet. And so we wanted to adapt this system and be able to also investigate kind of the presence of these convective flows. And so what we've done is we need to be able to create that shape, right? And so Professor Simchek has this really neat experimental system showing where they looked at dissolution of gypsum, and what they were able to do is kind of cast that gypsum into whatever shape they want. And so we've adapted that methodology to be able to create that very sinusoidal shape that, you know, my colleague used in kind of his numerical work. And you can see that after kind of this casting process, right, we use plaster of Paris and we let it set, we can get, you know, effectively the sinusoidal shape in whatever kind of dimensions that we want. The other challenge then experimentally is that we want to be able to image this dissolution process, but then be able to access the mineral after the fact so that we can do things like this 3D scanning, which lets us see the shape of the mineral after kind of reaction. And so what we've got here is effectively modeled off of kind of Healy-Shaw style cells where we've clamped together two pieces of, you know, polycarbonate, and we've carved in a little groove where we can have the gypsum sit. Now, the thing that is different, this is not strictly a Healy-Shaw cell, again, because our channels are a little bit larger and there's some depth to the gypsum, as you saw kind of earlier. But what we can do is we can put this experimental setup in our little flow system where we recycle our water to drive gypsum dissolution, and we image it with a camera. And we can see here, again, some dimensions for reference, as well as some orientation for what is happening in the experiment. We're driving water through this channel, and it reacts with the gypsum that we've set here. So experimentally, what happens when we change the Reynolds number, which is here just given by the flow rate, right? We keep the viscosity the same. We can see that as we increase the Reynolds number, we see more dissolution, but notably, we see that at the lower Reynolds number, we see lower dissolution at the front compared to the outlet. But at higher Reynolds number, we see the opposite. We see less dissolution at the inlet and a ton of dissolution at the outlet. And this makes sense. This kind of matches what we would expect in simulations. Now, keep in mind, again, low versus this higher case. Keep in mind that the Reynolds numbers aren't going to match exactly because we're dealing with kind of different reaction kinetics. And so there may be some differences as to kind of the threshold Reynolds numbers that lead to these kind of patterns. But it's encouraging that we see that with increasing Reynolds number, we see that switch in kind of the orientation of which side dissolves faster. And even better, if we look at the simulations, we can see that in the higher Reynolds number cases, there's actually an etching of the middle of the channel faster than the top or the bottom of the channel. And indeed, in this kind of Reynolds 400 experiment, we also see that behavior. We see that the recirculating flows are creating a shape that dissolves the center out faster than kind of the top or the bottom. So that's really encouraging. However, if you look a little bit carefully, you can see that at the lower Reynolds number cases, we're starting to see more dissolution at the top compared to the bottom, which suggests to us that there's some more complicated behavior here than is being captured in just the simulations. And indeed, what we see is that if we change the orientation of our experimental setup with respect to gravity, we see very strongly that impact, right? So in this bottom row, those are this is a continuation of that experiment I showed in the last slide. But if we, and that's where flow is perpendicular to gravity, you can see very clearly a strong dissolution at the top and much less dissolution at the bottom, though both fronts recede with time. If we change the orientation of the setup and we have flow parallel with gravity, what we see again is this more dissolution at the top compared to at the bottom, aligning kind of with what we expect. And indeed, if we look at 3D scans of this experiment, we very clearly see that in kind of the solid patterns. We can then go and estimate, you know, the strength of this effect via the Rayleigh number, where we're looking at essentially the density contrast compared against diffusion for the system. And we see that it's above 1,000. And we're still refining this analysis and kind of finding the right length scales to use and that sort of thing. But our preliminary estimates show that the Rayleigh number is quite large, and that indicates that there's definitely a strong kind of convection flow here, kind of free convection flow that is competing with the inertial flow. And so that's what I've got here for today. We've got this nice experimental platform that we're using to image dissolution in kind of 3D. We're also able to show how inertial fluid forces are really altering the shape of even a single kind of pore grain by altering the distribution of our reactants spatially. And finally, we can see that inertial fluid forces are competing with density-driven flows, and that is altering our dissolution patterns compared to what we would see in experiment. And I think that's it. I just have a few quick acknowledgements. NSF for funding this work, the Kang Research Group, Piotr Simczek. And yeah, so I'd be happy to then take any questions that you might have.
Thanks a lot, Michael. We welcome the audience to type in any questions. And also, if you have questions that you would like to send to the speakers after, you're, of course, very welcome to do so. I have one quick question myself. So just, you mentioned like the difference between gravity, like helping the flow, and then gravity perpendicular to the flow. Did you also test the opposite, like a gravity against the flow?
That's a great question, and that is an experiment that I'm looking forward to doing. Because you know, as you intuit, I think we will see very different behavior than the case where it's kind of aligned.
Super. Do we have any other questions from the audience here?
Maybe if someone is typing the question, I have one quick question to Michael. So in the beginning, you mentioned that recirculation flows can enhance reaction, but you said your simulation result with the gypsum case actually seems to be prohibiting or reducing the reaction, which then causes the dissolution more significant in the outlet. So can you provide some insights into what is making the recirculation flow enhancing the reaction, or sometimes when it's making to prevent the reaction?
Sure. So basically, you know, when we think about just recirculating flow with just kind of an arbitrary reaction, we have to remember that the kinetics of the reaction and the mechanism of the reaction are going to also have an impact on how the recirculating flow kind of alters these patterns. In these initial cases that I showed, what is controlling the reaction here? It is mixing of two different solutes leading to the chemical reaction. And so the recirculating flows serve to better mix reactants than in the case where those flows don't exist. However, in the case of both this calcite dissolution as well as the gypsum dissolution, we see the opposite case because the reaction kinetics now depend on your kind of distance from saturation. And so as the reaction proceeds, it actually consumes available reactant, therefore slowing down the overall kinetics. And so in this case, and this has been seen, I think, in other kind of recirculating dissolution flow cases, this actually leads to kind of a trapping of reactants, which will ultimately suppress the reaction rate rather than kind of enhance it.
Great. Do we have any other questions? If not, so then maybe we can finish this session here, and thanking both Michael and Michał. It's almost like two Michaels today, but it's a slightly different pronunciation from what I understood. Thanks again to both speakers, and then we move for the next Tea Time Talk session. Let's see if we have like the. Do we have the slide? Yeah, there it is. So it's planned for 13th of February. We are still looking for speakers. So we're also welcome anyone to send suggestions on speakers to our email, which you can find in the next slide there, porosmediattt@gmail.com. Not only for this session, but we're always building the list of potential speakers and for different places of the world, so different time zones as well. But the next session is 13th of February. And you will hear more about that in due time through social media and all the channels we use to spam the whole community as usual. Okay, so thank you very much, and we'll see you very soon. Bye.